Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sahar Aziz. I'm a professor of law here at Rutgers Law School and the founding director of the Center for Security, Race, and Rights. Thank you very much for coming today and learning or expressing your interest in learning about a very important topic that, while many of us were hoping would no longer be relevant, those of us who came of age a few decades ago, unfortunately, it is still relevant, and that is the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And as you all know, this is a very sensitive topic, it's a very important topic, and it's one that I think qualifies as the type of topic that we should be talking about a lot in law schools and in universities, because it's a very complicated issue that involves a deep history. It involves multiple states, for better or worse, that are involved in it, and it has links that are connected to what happened in Europe, to what happened in the Middle East, to colonialism, to World War II, to issues of self-determination and sovereignty and human rights and national security, and the list goes on. And oftentimes what many universities and entities will do is, because it's so complex, they don't want to talk about it, right? And they avoid the subject. And then the conversation ends up happening in areas or forums where it's not about the facts. The speakers aren't experts. It's really more based on either opinion, bias, stereotyping, racism, religious bigotry, and other forms of ideological motives that I don't think help solve the underlying problem, but ultimately serve as polarizing and divisive processes. So today we are very honored to have one of the premier experts on this issue of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. His formal introduction will come in shortly by my fellow, but I just wanted to put in a word of how grateful I am for Ambassador Hesham Youssef taking the time out of his busy schedule to come and speak to us here at Rutgers Law School, at Rutgers University, Newark, because this is not an easy area of expertise. You have to have wisdom, sound judgment, high intelligence, and many, many other skills that few of us have combined. And so we're very grateful to have someone who has lived, whether both studied it but also lived the experience. And I think what's important for us is to be able to learn from those experiences, whether we agree or don't agree. It's really more about just understanding the different experiences, especially from the position of an insider. And that's really hard to get. Many of us are outsiders in the negotiation processes and things that are happening behind the scenes that are not necessarily reported on. So I think that's where I'm particularly grateful, and Ambassador Hesham Youssef is of a very elite cohort of diplomats from Egypt that I fear are a dying breed, but hopefully that won't be the case in the future. But I will say that the Egyptian Foreign Ministry and the Minister of Foreign Affairs is a very selective career path. And so to have somebody of that caliber to come and speak to us is something that we're very fortunate to have. So before I pass it over to Joe Carr, the law fellow at the Center for Security, Race, and Rights, and a 2L here at Rutgers Law School, I just want to encourage you all to attend our Global Islamophobia in an Era of Populism conference this Thursday, March 12th, in New Brunswick on the Livingston campus. You can find all the information on csrr.rutgers.edu. Follow us on RUCSR on Twitter, Instagram, Rutgers CSRR. All the information is there. We're also live streaming in case you are not able to come to New Brunswick or you can't be at the whole conference. From 9:30 until 5, and the keynote is Ambassador Ibrahim Rasool, who is the South African ambassador to the United States from 2010 to 2015. And the panels will be discussing Islamophobia in the US, Islamophobia in Europe, and Islamophobia in Asia, with a particular focus with what's going on right now in India and Kashmir. So these are very timely topics. So with that, I will now cede the floor to Joe, who will give the formal introduction to Ambassador Hesham Youssef. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Aziz. So before I begin, I just want to remind everyone that we have registration forms. The New Jersey primary is June 2nd, and you have to submit these 21 days before that election. So make sure to take part in our democratic process. Also, we have our feedback forms for the Center of Security, Race, and Rights. If you could fill these out, let us know what we're doing right, what we can improve on. We'd really appreciate it. We're trying to make these events as best for the community. So Ambassador Hesham Youssef was a career diplomat with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Egypt. From 2014 to 2019, he served as Assistant Secretary General for Humanitarian, Cultural, and Social Affairs of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation and completed his term in July 2019. From 2001 to 2014, he served as senior official in the Arab League, as official spokesman, and later the Chief of Staff to Secretary General Ammar Moussa from 2003 to 2011. From 2012 to 2014, Mr. Yousef was a senior advisor to the Secretary General of the Arab League, and he worked on issues pertaining to crisis management as well as the reform of the Arab League. Ambassador Yousef has worked extensively on conflict resolution in the Middle East, and in particular, the Arab-Israeli conflict, reconciliation in Iraq, and the situation in Sudan. He has written several papers on reform in the Arab world and focused in the last 5 years on fragility and humanitarian situations in the Islamic world, in particular in Somalia, the Palestinian territories, Chad, Niger, and Myanmar. Ambassador Yousef joined the Egyptian Foreign Ministry in 1985. He was posted to the Egyptian Embassy in Canada from 88 to 92, and the Egyptian mission in Geneva, where he focused on the economic and trade issues in the United Nations and the WTO. He was a member of the cabinet of the Egyptian Minister for Foreign Affairs in the periods of 1992 to 95, and again from 99 to 2001. Ambassador Yousef graduated with a degree in physics from the Faculty of Science, Cairo University in 1980. From 80 to 83, he taught at Cairo University, the American University in Cairo, and Lehigh University in Pennsylvania. Ambassador Yousef holds a master's degree from St. John's College in New Mexico and the American University of Cairo. So with that, please join me in welcoming Ambassador Yousef to Rutgers Law School.
Thank you very much. Let me start by thanking Professor Sahar Aziz for the kind invitation. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's a pleasure to talk to all of you on an issue that, as she mentioned, has not been the focus of the international community for a few years, but now it has come back to the agenda, and I'll come to that. And I've been working on this issue for a number of decades, on and off, but it has been one of the constants in my career throughout my work at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Arab League, as well as the Organization of Islamic Cooperation from a humanitarian perspective, and now working on this issue as well at the United States Institute of Peace in Washington, D.C., but I'm speaking in my personal capacity and not representative of any of these institutions. And I will be addressing the Israeli-Palestinian conflict from a different perspective today. Since I am in a law school, I think it would be most appropriate to address this issue, perhaps from a legal perspective. And since President Trump presented his long-awaited initiative regarding achieving peace in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict on the 28th of January of this year, after around 3 years of preparations, I think it is most appropriate to also focus on this initiative that can be considered a major game changer in dealing with this conflict. I will address 5 main issues. The first issue is the role of law in resolving the conflict. The second is the status of the Palestinian territory. The third is the issue of sovereignty and issues pertaining to having something called a state plus, or even state plus plus, and the state minus, or a state minus minus. And then a number of false equivalences that are somewhat problematic in the plan, in the US plan. And finally, a few words on the Palestinian situation. Let me start by the role of the law in resolving the conflicts. I think the legal aspects pertaining to the conflict is one of the most fundamental reasons for the objections that were raised by the Palestinians and several countries when dealing with the recent US plan and the new US position in relation to the conflict. Even before the plan was released, the US adopted several controversial positions. I think one of the most revealing and perhaps the most significant was presented in a statement before the UN Security Council in July of 2019 by Jason Greenblatt, who is the former US Special Representative for International Negotiations. And in this statement before the Security Council, he seemed to divide the main issues pertaining to the conflict into three main categories. One category is aspects, in a sense, that are above international law, and then aspects that pertain to international law, and then finally, aspirations. On issues that are above the law, Greenblatt told the Security Council that there is, and I'm quoting here, that there is no international consensus or interpretation of international law that will persuade the United States or Israel that a city in which Jews have lived and worshipped for nearly 3,000 years and has been the capital of the Jewish state for 70 years is not today and forever the capital of Israel. End of quote. Implying, as indicated by an article in the Jerusalem Post at the time, that Israel's right to Jerusalem was above international law. Of course, there are several inaccurate and disputable elements in this statement, including the fact that East Jerusalem was under Jordanian control shortly after the State of Israel was established in 1948 and until the June 1967 war. But we can go into details later in our discussion if you wish. As for international law, Greenblatt told the Security Council that international law is not the vehicle through which the conflict could be resolved given the vast differences in interpretation of law regarding the conflict. So he discounted international law as a whole in addressing the conflict. And then finally he came to aspirations, and he told the Security Council that Palestinians continue to assert that East Jerusalem must be a capital for the Palestinians, adding that an aspiration is not a right, and aspirations belong to the negotiating table. And this is the crux of the problem, because the administration contends that there are some elements in the Israeli positions that are above international law, and that international law is not the route through which the conflict can be resolved, and that Israel has rights, and the Palestinians only have aspirations, and the resolution should be resolved through acknowledging and perhaps even accepting realities on the ground. Of course, several Security Council members criticized this US approach, not only because of this conflict, but also because of what this means to the international order that is supposed to be based on international law and the resolution not only of this conflict, but of conflicts in general. This approach was also criticized because it was felt that the US wanted to replace the current terms of reference for resolving the conflict to new terms of reference and new parameters for the solution. And this brings me to my second point regarding the status of the Palestinian territory. And on that issue, the current US position is that the West Bank is disputed and not occupied territory. And this is why the Trump plan indicated that the State of Israel and the United States do not believe that the State of Israel is legally bound to provide the Palestinians with 100% of the pre-1967 territory. Of course, this is contrary to a principle that is enshrined in UN Security Council Resolution 242, which is the basis, one of the bases for resolving this conflict, that spoke about the principle of the inadmissibility of the acquisition of territory by war. And there are numerous Security Council and General Assembly resolutions that consider the West Bank and Gaza as occupied Palestinian territory and that oppose any change in the status of this territory that is not agreed to by the parties through negotiations. And this also is part of the advisory opinion of the International Court of Justice on the wall that rejected the de facto annexation by Israel of parts of the West Bank. Related to that, the US Secretary of State announced in November 2019 a shift in Washington's policy towards Israeli settlements, when he declared that these settlements are not inconsistent with international law, something that has been debated for decades at the UN and beyond in relation to the legal status of these illegal settlements in occupied territories. And related to that is the third issue regarding sovereignty and whether we can have a state plus and a state minus. And security is a crucial issue to the Palestinians as it reflects the embodiment of their national aspirations for a sovereign, independent, and viable state. The Trump vision approaches sovereignty by outlining how concepts associated with sovereignty has evolved over time and how countries enter into agreements that set parameters essential to each nation in relation to aspects pertaining to sovereignty. However, of course, in the plan, this applies only to the Palestinians, because as far as Israel is concerned, sovereignty is mentioned and addressed in the context of the traditional norms of sovereignty that are accepted by the whole world. Not only that, Israel is also given an absolute right to make sovereign decisions in the Palestinian state that is suggested by the plan. And a very large number of limitations on the sovereignty of the state of Palestine in the plan are given in very minute details. I'll give you the titles of many of them, but they are countless to be included in a statement. The first one is that Israel has an overriding security responsibility over the whole state of Palestine. And this is similar in many aspects to the current situation of occupation. So there is not that much change in relation to that, but it is now put in a context of a solution. The second is that Israel will be responsible for security at all international crossings into the state of Palestine. And this is less than what the Palestinians even enjoy today in relation to the Rafah crossing between Gaza and Egypt, for example, where there is no Israeli presence at this border at this time. So at the end of the day, Israel will have a final say over who enters the Palestinian state and who doesn't. The third is that the State of Israel will continue to maintain control over the airspace and the electromagnetic spectrum as well. The fourth is that the State of Israel will retain sovereignty over territorial water. So the State of Palestine will have no sovereignty over territorial waters, and the plan mentions that this is essential for Israel's security and the security of the region. And it skipped a very important point, the point of what if oil or gas is discovered in this territorial water? Would this go to the Palestinians, or would this go to the Israelis, since they have sovereignty over these territorial waters? Also, the sixth point, that the State of Palestine will have no right to forge all kinds of arrangements, military, intelligence, security, with any state or any organization that adversely affect the State of Israel's security, as determined, and I'm quoting here, by the State of Israel. So Israel determines whether the State of Palestine can have an agreement on security cooperation with any country or within any organization, whether it's the UN, the Arab League, or otherwise, and so on. Of course, the seventh is that this would be a demilitarized state, which I think is not that big of a problem, because I don't think that they need to be a militarized state at this point. But it also, within that, it has all kinds of details that are problematic. For example, it says it is demilitarized, but it cannot also have offensive cyber and electronic warfare capabilities. How will this be monitored, and how will this be enforced? And that's another legal dimension that perhaps is worthy of further study as well. The eighth point is regarding security, Palestinian security. And the plan says that any expansion of the Palestinian security capabilities beyond the capabilities that exist on the date that this vision is released shall be subject to agreement with the State of Israel. So the argument is that what they have today is enough when they have a state, which I think is rather strange. The ninth point is that the State of Israel will maintain the right to dismantle and destroy any facility in the State of Palestine that is used for the production of prohibited weapons, which can be understood, but then for any other hostile purposes. And of course, the hostile purposes will be also defined by Israel. So there is a state that will have the right to dismantle and destroy any facility in another state because of reasons that they see are hostile, has hostile purposes. It also indicates something interesting about transportation corridors, because it mentions that there will be all kinds of transportation corridors between the Palestinian fragments that constitute the state, and that this would greatly, according to the plan, greatly reduce the need for checkpoints. This also means that there will be checkpoints by one state in another state. And then, to add to that as well, and it mentions that to the extent reasonably possible, solely as determined by the State of Israel, the State of Israel will rely on blimps, drones, and similar aerial equipment for security purpose in order to reduce the Israeli security footprint within the State of Palestine. So they also have this right. And then to one of the most fundamental issues pertaining to the conflict, and this is the issue of refugees. And in as far as refugees are concerned, this plan indicates that there are refugees, many Palestinian refugees, in the Middle East that come from war-torn countries. And I'm quoting here, such as Syria and Lebanon, that are extremely hostile toward the state of Israel. And in order to address this concern, therefore, Israel will have to agree for any of these refugees to, and they use the word immigrate. So it's not that they're going back as refugees to a country that has now become their own. No, they can immigrate. And the use of term is quite interesting because it limits this right to immigrate with an agreement regarding security between Israel and Palestine. And then, to add to that, it mentions that the rate of movement of refugees from outside Gaza and the West Bank into the state of Palestine will have to be agreed also by the Israelis and Palestinians. So it's not that the Palestinians want to return and Palestine can absorb them, that they can return. No, they can't. And there are all kinds of regulating factors, including economic forces, incentive structures, rate of entry can overwhelm the development of infrastructure and the economy of the state of Palestine, or increase security risks to the state of Israel. So they have a veto of who returns and who doesn't, and when, and the rate, and so on. Finally, another legal limitation is in relation to joining international organizations. And here it is also mentioned in a very interesting way that the state of Palestine may not join any international organization if such membership would contradict commitments of the state of Palestine to demilitarization and cessation of political and judicial warfare against the state of Israel. And I'm in a law school, so I will not attempt to address what it means to seize, to stop political and judicial warfare. And it is clarified later on in the vision by saying that the PLO shall dismiss all pending actions against the state of Israel and the United States and any of their citizens before the International Criminal Court, the International Court of Justice, and all other tribunals, and before Interpol as well. So these are the kinds of limitations that are put on a state, and this is why there are many who are arguing that this is not a state. But then what are the conditions for the establishment of this state? And there are 5 conditions for the establishment of this state. And these 5 conditions, some of them are reasonable conditions, but they have not been put for the vast majority of states in the world before. So the first one is establishing rule of law, freedom of press, free and fair elections, respect for human rights, all noble causes, and I'm in full support of all of them. The second condition is that the Palestinians should establish transparent, independent, creditworthy financial institutions capable of engaging in the international market and so on, which is also something that is extremely important, but it is now put as a condition for the establishment of a state. The third, which is much more controversial and difficult to prove, is that the Palestinians shall end all programs, including school curricula and textbooks that serve to incite or promote hatred or antagonism towards its neighbors, or which compensate or incentivize criminal or violent activity. Of course, this applies only to the Palestinians. The fourth is that the Palestinians shall have achieved civilian and law enforcement control over all of its territory and demilitarized its whole population. And finally, the Palestinians shall have complied with all the other items and conditions of the vision, meaning all the items regarding sovereignty that I mentioned earlier. I think that the vast majorities of the countries in our part of the world would not pass this test of statehood today. So if you apply all these conditions on the vast majority of countries in our region, they will not pass this test. But it's not only that. I think one of the major difficulties is that one party to the conflict will become both judge and jury. There are no independent determination or verification of anything in this plan. Everything is subject to a US-Israeli determination, and only an Israeli-US determination. And it's interesting because the plan also has a map that they said is a conceptual map, and it takes into account a number of things. Of course, the first amongst which is the security requirements of Israel. But the second is that it takes into account the state of Israel's valid, legal, and historical claims. So there is nothing in the document that says that there are any valid, legal, or historical Palestinian claims as well. I took more than I should, so I will be very brief in the remaining part about equivalences, false equivalences, because there are a number of false equivalences in the plan. The first is that it dealt with Palestinian refugees and Jews that left different countries in the Arab world as having the same problem, while I think the problem is vastly different, because one of them is in relation to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and one is in relation to the problems that Israel or Jews in Israel may have with any Arab country in which they feel that they left in a manner that is detrimental to their interests or property or whatever. So if they have claims, then they have to address it, but we should not have an equivalence between these two issues. The second is that the plan argues that there will be no forced population transfers and equates the Palestinians with the Israelis, while the Israelis are living in illegal settlements, but the Palestinians are living in their land. So when you say, okay, we will not remove anybody from their land, that is absolutely fine. But you equated those who are living in illegal settlements, including settlements that are illegal in accordance to Israel's law, then I think that this is a false equivalence as well. It also equates Palestinians and Israelis who will be living in enclaves within the two states, and this is also inaccurate because they're not supposed to be dealt with in the same manner, because these are still also Israelis who are living in illegal settlements. And secondly, the security of Israel will be the determinant factor in dealing with these two populations. And finally, the plan says that there will be freedom of access to all religions, to all religious sites of all faiths in both states. Of course, this equates also Al-Masjid al-Aqsa, which the Israelis do not pray in, and they want to pray in Al-Masjid al-Aqsa. So when they have a sentence of that nature, then it means that Jews will be allowed to pray in Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is something that has been controversial for decades. I'll end with a few points on the Palestinians, because so as not to give the impression that the Palestinians are doing fine and well. No, they aren't. They are in a chaotic situation. They are divided between Fatah and Hamas, between Gaza and the West Bank, and this is detrimental to the interests of the Palestinians. They have a bad governance structure. They do not have rule of law. They have corruption that they need to fight. They have state building that they need to achieve, and there is a lot that they need to do. They have to reform the PLO, which is the Palestinian Liberation Organization that is supposed to be a representative of the Palestinians, but is no longer achieving this goal. They have to respect human rights. They have a very long list of things that they need to do. But I think they need also help in order to achieve these objectives. Let me conclude by indicating that this conflict is entering a critical phase, and without major rectification of how the international community deals with this issue, then we will probably be preparing for another round of prolonged confrontation, conflict, and violence that I think may remain with us for decades. This is a very complex and challenging conflict, and these challenges are daunting, but I think that giving up is not supposed to be an option. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Yousef. So first I want to praise you for being able to speak about a subject that is so depressing and so troubling with such poise, because I think a lot of us get very emotional about it. And this is a situation where the two sides are not equal.